In the winter of 1887, on a snowy night, the town council sat down and decided the fate of 7 children, not out of malice, but because they believed it was the only thing they could do. Lydia Mercer, a widow with nothing but her bare hands and 7 mouths to feed, stood in that freezing room and listened as they judged the future of her children. But then a man the whole town feared walked in and spoke 3 words that changed everything. If you want to know what happens next, watch until the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. The snow had been falling for 11 days straight when they put Silas Mercer in the ground. It wasn't much of a burial. The ground was frozen 8 inches down, and the men who dug the grave had to use iron bars to break through the top layer before they could get anywhere with shovels. They worked in shifts, 4 men at a time, swearing under their breath and stopping every few minutes to beat warmth back into their hands. Reverend Aldous said his words fast, the way a man does when the cold has gotten into his jaw. The children stood in a line beside their mother, oldest to youngest, the way Silas had always arranged them for church. And Lydia held the baby against her chest and watched them lower her husband into the earth and felt something inside her go very quiet. That quietness scared her more than the grief did. She had expected the grief. What she hadn't expected was how it would hollow her out and leave this strange, still emptiness in its place, as if the part of her that knew how to be afraid had simply shut itself off to let her function. Silas Mercer had been the best hunter in the Caldwell Basin. Everybody said so, and it was true. He could track a deer through frozen pine needles without leaving so much as a scuff mark himself. He knew where the elk bedded in October and where they moved by December. He knew the ridge lines and the creek bottoms and the patterns of wind in the high country the way other men knew their own kitchen tables. For 11 years, that knowledge had fed his family and kept them alive through 7 Rocky Mountain winters. Then he went out one morning in a blizzard that wasn't supposed to amount to much, and a snow-covered ravine gave way. And that was the end of Silas Mercer. They found him 2 days later. The oldest boy, Thomas, was the one who spotted the boot sticking up from the drift. He was 14 years old, and he never talked about that morning afterward, not to anyone, and Lydia never asked him to. The town of Aldworth sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges at an elevation that made every winter feel like a personal insult. It had a general store, a feed barn, a church, a school that operated 4 months a year, and roughly 60 families spread out across the valley floor in lower slopes. The people there were not unkind, most of them. They were practical, the way frontier people learn to be practical when the alternative is dying. They helped each other with harvests and barn raisings and difficult births. They brought food when someone was sick. They sat with the dying. But practical people in hard country also understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic of the Mercer family's situation was not good. Lydia was 34 years old with 7 children ranging from Thomas at 14 down to infant Clara, who was 8 months and still nursing. The family had a 2-room cabin on the east edge of town, a milk cow that was running thin, half a quart of firewood, and a root cellar that held maybe 6 weeks of preserved food if they were careful. Silas's rifle was worth something, but selling it meant losing the one tool that might help them survive. She had no people nearby. Her own family was in Ohio. Silas's people were scattered or dead. There was no one to send for. The first week after the funeral, neighbors brought food. A pot of beans here, a slab of salt pork there. The Halverson woman left 2 loaves of bread on the doorstep without knocking. Lydia accepted everything with a straight back and a careful thank you. And at night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the table and did sums in her head, and the sums kept coming out wrong. But she heard about the meeting from Agnes Pollock, who ran the post station and knew everything that happened in Aldworth before it happened. Lydia! Agnes had caught her outside the general store, grabbing her arm with the directness of a woman who didn't have time to soften things. "There's a meeting tonight at the Grange Hall, about your family." Lydia had gone still. "About my family. About what's to be done. About the children." Agnes's face was not unkind, but it was careful. "I thought you should know before you heard it some other way." "Who called the meeting?" "Aldous. And Harmon Fitch. And I believe Walt Gruber." Agnes hesitated. "Lydia, they mean well. I want you to know that." "Do they?" "They're worried about the children. About whether you can—" She stopped. "Whether I can manage. Lydia said it flat, without inflection. It's winter. It's a hard winter. Agnes let go of her arm. Come tonight. You should be there. The Grange Hall held 40 people, and it held nearly that many that evening. Lydia sat in the second row with Thomas beside her, because Thomas was 14 and the oldest, and she wanted him to see this, whatever it turned out to be. The other children were at the cabin with the Halverson girl watching them. Reverend Aldous opened with a prayer, and then got straight to the point, which was one thing Lydia had always appreciated about him. He was a bony, dry-spoken man who didn't enjoy sentiment. We're here because the Mercer family is in a position that none of us wants to see, he said. 7 children, no father, no income, winter at full strength. Mrs. Mercer is a capable woman. Nobody's questioning that. He looked at her briefly when he said it, and she looked back without expression. But capable doesn't feed 7 children through February and March, when you've got 6 weeks of food and no hunter in the house. There was a murmur through the room. Harmon Fitch stood up without being invited to. He was the largest landowner in the valley, a big man with a gray beard, and the manner of someone who had decided long ago that his opinions deserved more airtime than other people's. The way I see it, there's one practical solution, he said. The children need to be placed. The older ones can work for their keep. The younger ones, there are families here who'd take a child or two. It spreads the burden. The word burden dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Lydia didn't move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she let the words settle, and then she said clearly enough for the whole room to hear, My children are not a burden to be spread. Fitch looked at her. Mrs. Mercer, they are my children. Her voice was level. They are not livestock to be divided among homesteads because it's convenient. Ma'am, nobody is saying to... You just said it. She looked around the room slowly, taking in the faces. Some of them looked away. Some didn't. You are sitting in this hall deciding what to do with my family, and I am sitting here listening to it. So let's at least be honest about what we're discussing. Aldous raised his hand to quiet the room. Mrs. Mercer, the concern is real. How do you intend to feed 7 children? Where is the income coming from? What happens when the firewood runs out in 3 weeks? The questions were fair. She knew they were fair. That was the worst part. The people in this room weren't wrong about the arithmetic. They were wrong about the answer, but they weren't wrong about the problem. I need time, she said. How much time? Enough to figure out a solution that doesn't involve handing my children to strangers. Fitch made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Mrs. Mercer, winter doesn't negotiate. No, she said. It doesn't, neither do I. There was a silence, and in that silence the door at the back of the Grange Hall opened and let in a gust of cold air, and a man that most of the room visibly flinched from. Lydia had never seen Gideon Hale up close before. She'd seen him at a distance twice, once on the road north of town, once crossing the creek near the mill, and both times she'd had the impression of a man who existed slightly outside of ordinary human scale. Not in height exactly, though he was tall. Something else. Something in the way he moved, or the way he didn't hurry. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40. It was hard to tell. His face had been worked over by weather into something that revealed very little. Dark beard, heavy coat, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin coming off him in the cold air. He had a rifle slung across his back, and he carried it the way other men carried hats, without thinking about it. The room got quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Gideon Hale lived in the high mountains north of Aldworth, above the tree line, in a cabin that most people in town had never seen and several people weren't sure existed. He came down to trade twice a year, maybe 3 times. He didn't drink at the saloon, he didn't attend church. He had no family that anyone knew of and no apparent interest in acquiring one. The stories about him ranged from slightly strange to genuinely alarming, depending on who was telling them and how much they'd had to drink. He walked down the center of the hall and stopped near the front, and the crowd parted around him without anyone making a conscious decision to do so. I heard what you're planning, he said. His voice was lower than Lydia had expected. Quiet, but the kind of quiet that carries. Splitting up those kids. Fitch straightened. This is a private meeting, Hale. Hall's not locked. Gideon looked at Fitch with the mild, unimpressed expression of a man who has spent too much time in wilderness to be intimidated by a gray-bearded landowner. I've got a proposition. You don't have any standing here to make "let him speak." That was Walt Gruber, from the left side of the room. Walt was a quiet man who rarely inserted himself into things, which meant when he did, people listened. Gideon turned and looked at Lydia directly. Not at the room. At her. It was disconcerting, not in an unfriendly way, but in the way of a person who has decided that the only relevant party in a conversation is the one it actually concerns. "My cabin's on the north slope above the ridge," he said. 6 rooms. Solid built. I've been at it 12 years. Root cellar's got food enough for the winter and then some. I've got firewood stacked to the rafters and 2 more cords cut. I know every trap line and hunting ground on that mountain. The room was so quiet, Lydia could hear Thomas breathing beside her. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Gideon held her gaze. "I'll take every one of them." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely, the kind where people are processing something that doesn't fit any category they already have. Fitch found his voice first. "You'll take—" He stopped, started again. "Hale, you live alone in the mountains. You've lived alone for how long? 14 years? You don't know anything about children." "I know about surviving winter." Gideon's tone didn't shift. "Which is the problem you're trying to solve." "This is—" Fitch looked around the room as if hoping someone else would supply the right word. "This is absurd. You're talking about moving a widow and 7 children into the mountains with a man nobody in this town knows." "You know enough about me," Gideon said. "You know I'm still alive up there. That's more than most men could say." Lydia looked at him. She was trying to read him, something she was usually decent at, and finding that he was harder to read than most people. Not because he was hiding anything, she thought, more because there wasn't much performance in him. What she was seeing was probably most of what was there. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Why would you do this?" Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite discomfort, more like a man deciding how honest to be with a question that deserves honesty. "I've got the space and the supplies and the knowledge," he said finally. "Seems like waste to let kids get split up when I've got what it takes to prevent it." "That's not a reason," she said. "That's a capability." A long pause. Around them, the hall full of people seemed to hold its collective breath. "My mother had 5 of us," Gideon said. "Father was killed by a horse when I was 9. Town meeting decided to split us up. I ended up in a household 60 miles from the nearest sibling. Never saw most of them again." He said it without apparent self-pity, the way a man states a fact about geography or weather. "Took me a long time to understand what that cost." The room was very still. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Thomas, who was staring at Gideon with an expression she couldn't fully interpret, wariness and something else beneath it. "I'd want to see the cabin first," she said. Fitch made a noise of protest. "Mrs. Mercer, you cannot seriously be considering—" "Mr. Fitch," she turned and looked at him. "How many of my children are you personally prepared to take into your home?" He blinked. "That's not— How many?" She looked around the room. "Any of you. How many are you willing to take? Not as labor, not as farmhands, as children, with all the difficulty that entails." She waited. No one answered. "Then I think you can allow me to consider every available option." She looked back at Gideon. "I'll want to see it," she said again, "before I decide anything." He nodded once. "I'll take you up tomorrow, if the weather holds." That night, after the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet, except for the wind working at the eaves, Lydia sat at the table with a candle and a piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew and everything she didn't. What she knew: 6 weeks of food, maybe less if she wasn't careful. 3 weeks of firewood. 1 rifle she didn't know how to use properly. 7 children. No income. February still ahead of them, and February in the Caldwell Basin was the month that broke things. What she didn't know: whether Gideon Hale's cabin was what he said it was. Whether he was what he seemed to be. Whether a man who had lived alone in mountains for 14 years was capable of sharing that life with 8 other people. Whether any of this was remotely sane. She sat there for a long time, listening to the wind and the creak of the walls and the small sounds of her children sleeping, and she thought about the faces in that Grange hall. The people who had brought her food and sat with careful expressions while Harmon Fitch said the word burden. Good people, most of them. Practical people. People who genuinely believed they were solving a problem. They weren't wrong that there was a problem. They were just wrong about which problem mattered most. The problem wasn't whether her children ate this winter. The problem was whether they stayed a family. She had watched what happened when families got split up along necessity's lines. She'd seen it twice in her own childhood. Cousins sent to aunts, a brother farmed out to a neighbor. And she knew that the separations that happen in winter have a way of becoming permanent by spring. People adjust. Lives reshape themselves around an absence, and then the absence just becomes the shape of things. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket without having written anything on it. Thomas appeared in the doorway from the back room, barefoot on the cold floor, wrapped in his blanket. "Mama, go back to sleep, Thomas. Are we going to be split up?" She looked at him across the candlelit room. He was 14, which was old enough to have understood everything said in that Grange hall tonight, and young enough to still need her to tell him it wasn't going to happen. "No," she said. "How?" "I don't know yet." She paused. "But no, we stay together. That's the only thing that's already decided." He stood there for a moment, considering this. Then he went back to bed. Lydia blew out the candle and sat in the dark and listened to the wind. The morning was iron gray and cold enough that her breath frosted the air inside the cabin until she got the fire going. She fed the children cornmeal porridge, stretched thin, with a little molasses, and told them she was going out for the day and that Thomas was in charge, and that no one was to fight about anything because she would find out and there would be consequences. "Where are you going?" asked Nora, who was 9 and had inherited Silas's habit of treating every piece of information as insufficient. "To look at something." "What something?" "Nora." "I'm just asking." "I know you are. Now eat your porridge." Gideon was waiting at the edge of town where the road bent north, exactly where he'd said he'd be, at exactly the time they'd agreed. He had 2 horses, his own, a rangy dark bay that looked like it had opinions, and a second one, smaller, that he'd apparently brought for her. He looked at her when she arrived and nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "It's steep in places. Tell me if you need to stop." "I'll tell you." They rode in silence for the first half hour. The road north of town became a track, and then the track became a trail, and then the trail got steep enough that Lydia had to lean forward in the saddle and let the horse pick its own path through the snow. The trees closed in, lodgepole pine, then spruce, growing thicker and darker as they climbed. The world got quieter with altitude. Sound behaved differently up here. The wind had a different character, less chaotic than in the valley, more purposeful. She watched Gideon ride ahead of her and tried to learn what she could from the way he moved through this terrain. He wasn't showing off. There was nothing performative about him at all, which was itself informative. He knew where he was going the way she knew the layout of her own kitchen. Every adjustment of his body, every subtle shift in direction came from familiarity rather than decision. This was his country. That was clear. "How far?" she asked when they'd been riding about 40 minutes. "Another hour, little less if the snow's packed on the upper slope." She nodded. They rode on. Aunt. The cabin appeared through the trees without warning, which was its first surprise. She had expected something crude, something that confirmed the stories, a rough lean-to maybe, a half-built structure that only a man living alone would consider adequate. What she found instead was a cabin that had been built with patience and real skill, settled into the hillside as if it belonged there, logs chinked tight, roof steeply pitched for snow load, a porch along the south face. A woodpile that ran the length of the east wall and stood 4 feet high, covered with oilcloth. A second, smaller structure, a smokehouse, she thought. Another building beyond that, low-roofed, that might be a root cellar built into the hillside. She sat on her horse and looked at it. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Started small, added on over the years." Gideon dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. Come inside. The interior was warm and smelled of pine and dried herbs and something meaty and good from a pot on the stove. It was clean, not immaculate, not the cleanliness of someone who has scrubbed for a visitor, but the functional order of a person who knows where everything is and keeps it there, because losing things in winter can kill you. There were shelves along every wall, loaded with supplies: dried beans, cornmeal, rice, salt pork, jerked meat, jars of preserved vegetables she couldn't identify from a distance. She walked to the shelves and looked at them closely, ran her finger along one jar, reading the label in Gideon's tight handwriting. Pickled beets, August, green beans, dried venison. "This is more food than you need for one winter," she said. "I know. You pack for more than you need. Always." She turned and looked at the room again. 2 cots along one wall, a table big enough for 4, maybe 5. A second door at the back. "You said 6 rooms. Through there. I've been building out the back. Started it 3 years ago. 2 more rooms finished, one that's close." He opened the back door and she followed him through. The addition was rougher than the main cabin, but sound. 2 rooms with plank floors and small windows. Another beyond, framed but not yet chinked, cold air seeping through the gaps. "That one I can finish in a week," he said. She stood in the doorway of the second room and looked at the space and did the arithmetic she'd been doing since last night. 7 children. 2 rooms finished, 1 finishable. The main room, which could sleep some of them. Her and Clara together. That was 1 space. Thomas could probably share with the older boys, Martin and Jacob. The girls, Nora, Hannah, and little May, together in 1 room. It was tight. It was genuinely tight. But it was together. "Show me the root cellar," she said. The root cellar was dug into the hillside behind the cabin, reinforced with timber, sealed against the cold with a door that required both hands to open. Inside, in the particular cold but not freezing temperature that made root cellars valuable, she found potatoes, turnips, carrots, dried corn, smoked fish, several haunches of venison wrapped in cloth, a barrel of dried apple rings, salt, sugar, and at least 4 varieties of dried beans. She stood in the middle of it with a lantern and looked at all of it and said nothing for a while. "This is a lot of food," she finally said. "Good year for hunting. Good garden last summer." Gideon leaned against the doorframe. "I don't waste." "You'd have to share all of this." "I know. With 8 people, 7 of them children." "I know, Mrs. Mercer." She turned and looked at him. In the lantern light, his face was less readable than ever, but there was something in his eyes that she thought might be patience. The particular patience of a man who has learned that rushing conclusions is expensive. "Why haven't you built a family yourself?" she asked. "If you have all of this, the space, the food, the skill." He was quiet for a moment. "Haven't found anyone who wanted to come up a mountain." "Most people don't." "No. And now you're inviting 8 of us. Your situation's different." "How?" He met her eyes. "You're not coming because you want the mountain. You're coming because you need your children to stay together. That's the only reason that matters." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching it, looking for the thing that would tell her this was wrong, that the stories were right, that this man who lived alone in the high country for 14 years was something to be afraid of. She didn't find it. What she found instead was a man who was lonely in a way he'd probably stopped noticing, who had more supplies than one person needed, and who had sat in a crowded hall the night before and watched strangers divide up a family and had felt something pull at him that he couldn't ignore. She understood that pull. She didn't fully trust it, not yet. Trust was something you built with evidence, but she understood it. "I'm going to sleep on it," she said. He nodded. "That's fair. I'll have an answer tomorrow morning. I'll be here." She rode back down the mountain alone. He'd offered to ride with her, but she'd said no. She wanted the time, and he'd accepted that without argument, which was itself a point in his favor. The valley spread out below her as she descended, gray-white and quiet in the thin winter light. She could see the rooftops of Aldworth from the lower switchbacks, the Grange Hall, the church, the line of the main street, the place her children had been born, the place where the people who brought her bread and beans had also sat in a hall and talked about which family might take which child. She rode back into town in the late afternoon and found Thomas on the porch with Jacob, both of them pretending not to be watching for her. "Well," Thomas said before she'd even dismounted. She looked at her oldest son, his father's jaw and his grandmother's eyes, standing in the cold with his arms crossed and the weight of something too adult on his face. "Pack what you can carry," she said. "We leave tomorrow morning." Thomas stared at her. "You're serious?" "I am." "Mama, that man—" He stopped. "People say things about him. People said things about your father too before they knew him." She tied the horse to the rail and turned to face her son. "I need you to trust me. And I need you to help your brothers and sisters pack tonight without frightening them. Can you do that?" He was quiet for a moment, 14 years old, trying to decide if he was still a child or not. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, and then she went inside to tell the rest of her children that their life was about to change completely. She did not tell them it was going to be fine. She didn't know if it was going to be fine. She told them they were going to stay together, and that was the only promise she was in a position to make. By the time she put the baby down that night, the cabin was half packed, and the children were asleep in their clothes, and the wind had picked up again off the mountain. Not soft, not gentle, the kind of wind that meant business. And Lydia sat one last time at the table where Silas used to sit across from her in the evenings, and she thought, "I don't know if this is right. I don't know if I'm brave or just desperate. Maybe," she thought, "those two things look the same from the outside." She blew out the candle. Tomorrow they would go up the mountain. They left before sunrise. Lydia had decided the night before that an early departure was better than a public one, and she'd been right. The street was empty when they loaded the horses, just pale snow and the sound of the wind. No neighbors leaning on fence posts with opinions about what she was doing. Thomas led the first horse, a borrowed animal from the Halverson stable, loaded with the heavy things, the iron pot, the tools, the folded quilts. Jacob, who was 11 and prone to dropping things, carried Clara bundled against his chest with both arms locked like he was holding something irreplaceable, which he was. Nora complained about the cold until Lydia gave her a look that stopped it. The younger ones, Hannah, May, and 8-year-old Will, moved in a half-asleep cluster, their breath rising in small clouds. Gideon was waiting where the road bent north, same place as the morning before. He didn't say anything when they appeared out of the dark. He just looked at the line of them. 7 children, 1 woman, 2 loaded horses, and then he turned his bay horse up the trail and started moving. It took twice as long going up with children as it had taken Lydia alone the previous day. Will tripped on a root buried under snow and went down hard on his knee, and there was crying for a while that Lydia managed with her hand on the back of his neck and her voice low and steady. Hannah's boots were not good for this terrain, a fact Lydia had known and felt guilty about and could do nothing about. And by the time they reached the midpoint of the climb, Hannah was limping on the left side. Gideon noticed before Lydia did. He stopped his horse and came back and crouched down and looked at Hannah's foot without asking permission or making a production of it. "Wet through," he said. "My boots leak," Hannah said, with the dignity of a 7-year-old trying not to show she was miserable. He pulled off his outer scarf without comment and wrapped it around her boot and the lower part of her leg in a way that would at least slow the wet. Then he picked her up and put her on the horse in front of him, and that was that. Hannah sat on the saddle looking like she couldn't decide whether to be grateful or terrified, and she ended up being both, which was probably reasonable. They reached the cabin as the light was turning the color of pewter across the eastern ridge. Pale and thin but there, the sky lightening above the peaks while the valley below was still in shadow. Lydia watched the children's faces when the cabin came through the trees. The woodpile, the porch, the smoke already starting from the chimney because Gideon had banked the fire before coming down to meet them. She watched them take it in. May was the first one to say anything. She was 6 years old and had a habit of announcing her observations as if they were findings. "It's bigger than our house," she said. "It is," Lydia said. "Does it have a floor?" "Yes, May, it has a floor." May seemed to find this satisfactory. She walked up the porch steps and pulled open the door and went inside, and the others followed her the way they often followed May, on the logic that if the smallest one had already done it, it was probably safe. The first 3 days were the adjustment period, which was a polite way of saying they were the hardest days. The cabin was bigger than their old place in Aldworth, but 8 people are 8 people, and the geography of shared space requires negotiation that no amount of square footage can eliminate. The younger children shared one of the back rooms on two narrow cots pushed together, a configuration that resulted in exactly the nightly arguments about blanket distribution that Lydia had anticipated. Thomas claimed the other finished back room as territory for himself, Martin, and Jacob, and within 24 hours there was already a system of which shelf belonged to whom and a prohibition on touching the shelf that belonged to Jacob, who was possessive about his things in the specific way of middle children. Gideon moved himself onto a cot near the stove in the main room, which Lydia discovered the first morning and immediately felt was wrong. "This is your cabin," she told him when she found him rolling up his bedding at first light. "You should have your room. That room's yours. Yours and the baby's." He said it the way he said most things, settled like a decision that had already been made. "I sleep light. The stove suits me." "Gideon, Mrs. Mercer." He looked at her directly. "I've slept in worse places than a warm floor. Let's not make it a problem." She wanted to argue and recognize she didn't have a strong enough position to do it. "Fine," she said, "but I want that understood as temporary." Understood? It was not, in fact, temporary, but they both let that sit. The mornings had a shape to them that emerged by the third day, not because anyone designed it, but because 8 people in close quarters develop routines by sheer necessity. Gideon was up first, always. Fire built back up from the banked coals by the time Lydia came out with Clara. She would feed Clara and start breakfast, cornmeal again, because they had a lot of it, or oatmeal from the stores Gideon had laid in. And Gideon would have already been outside, already done the first check of the animal pens in the woodpile, already returned smelling of cold air and pine. He would come in and pour coffee without asking if she wanted any, and put a cup at her elbow, and she would take it without saying thank you, and this small exchange became a kind of language between them. The children, though, were harder. Thomas was the problem she'd expected. He was 14 and the oldest, and had spent the weeks since his father's death trying to be the man of the family in a way that was both admirable and slightly exhausting, and Gideon's presence in that role, or near that role, or somewhere adjacent to it, required Thomas to recalibrate something fundamental about his own position. He wasn't hostile, exactly. He was watchful. He did what was asked. He worked hard. He kept his mouth shut around Gideon in a deliberate way that was its own form of statement. At dinner the first night, he sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking up. Gideon seemed to understand this. He didn't push. He didn't make friendly overtures or try to win Thomas over with extra attention, which Lydia thought was the exact right instinct. Thomas would have rejected any obvious effort as condescension. Instead, Gideon simply let him watch. It was Martin who surprised her. Martin was 12, the second oldest, and had always been the one she worried about less because he was steady and adaptable in a way Thomas wasn't. But something about the move, about the mountain, about the fundamental disruption of everything familiar had made him quiet in a way that sat differently from his usual temperament. He ate his meals without complaint. He did his assigned tasks. He did not talk. On the 4th day, Lydia found him sitting alone on the far side of the woodpile in the cold, not doing anything, just sitting. She sat down beside him, which required some maneuvering given the slope of the ground and the fact that she was carrying Clara. "Talk to me," she said. Martin was quiet for a while. Snow was falling lightly, the soft kind that fell straight down when the wind wasn't moving. "I keep thinking about Papa," he said finally. Whether he'd think this was okay. The directness of it caught her off guard. "What makes you ask that?" "We're living with a stranger, in the mountains. That's—" He stopped. Papa would have had things to say about that. Lydia thought about Silas, who had in fact always had things to say, about everything, with great confidence and variable accuracy. She felt the familiar pull of grief, and under it, a complicated mixture of things she didn't have words for in front of her 12-year-old. "Your father would want you fed and safe and together," she said. Everything else would have been negotiable. Martin considered this. "Do you think Gideon's okay?" "I think he's doing more for us than he has any particular reason to." "That's not the same as okay." "No," she said, "but it's something." Martin sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "He showed me how the smoke vent works this morning, so you can adjust the draw depending on the wind direction." "Did he? It's actually pretty interesting." Lydia looked at her son and recognized that this was as close as he was going to come, right now, to saying he was going to be all right. "Good," she said. "Maybe you can show me later." Martin almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The practical education started almost immediately, because on a mountain in February, practical education isn't optional. It's the difference between managing and being managed by the situation. Gideon taught them in the way of someone who has learned that explanation gets you only so far, and that demonstration followed by repetition is the only method that sticks. He showed Thomas and Martin how to read the woodpile, which pieces burned long, which burned hot, how to stack new wood so the bottom stayed dry, how much to burn in a night versus how much to hold back. He showed Lydia how the smokehouse worked, how to check the seal on the meat, what to look for when something had gone off. He showed her the trap lines. Not all of them, but the nearest ones, the ones she could check herself if she needed to. He was a patient teacher. Not warm, exactly, but patient, which she was finding was actually more useful than warm. "You keep looking at me like you're waiting for me to make a mistake," she said one morning when they were checking the closest trap line together, and he had just corrected her for the second time about how to reset a snare. He looked at her. "I'm looking at you to see if you're getting it. There's a difference." "Yes." She reset the snare again, adjusting the tension the way he'd shown her. "Better?" He studied it for a moment. "Better. Still a little loose on the left side." She fixed the left side. Now it's right." She stood and looked at him. "How do you teach someone something without making them feel like an idiot?" "You don't always," he said. There was an honesty in that she respected. She picked up her end of the pack and they moved on to the next line. What struck her most about those first weeks was how much she didn't know. She had thought herself competent. She had run a household, raised children, managed the thousand small logistics of frontier life. And she was competent in the ways she'd been required to be. But the mountain demanded a different set of competencies, and the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know was wide enough that she had to stay humble about it, which was not her natural inclination. She burned dinner twice in the first week because the stove ran hotter than she was accustomed to. She misjudged the distance to the water source and ran the bucket too far into the ice shelf, which broke through and soaked her to the forearm. She tried to bring in firewood without gloves one afternoon. Just a quick trip, she'd thought, just a few pieces. And her hands were stiff and clumsy for 2 hours afterward. Gideon didn't make her feel foolish about any of it. He corrected her when necessary, showed her the right way, and moved on. That was its own kind of courtesy. The hardest part of those first weeks was not the physical adjustment, it was the sound. Their old cabin in Aldworth had been small and drafty, but it sat on flat ground, and the sounds of the valley were ordinary sounds: horses, wind, occasionally voices from the road. The mountain was different. At night, it produced a repertoire of sounds that the children, who had never spent a night above the valley floor, were not prepared for. The wind was the worst of it. It came off the peaks at angles that made the cabin walls sound like they were being tested, not maliciously, but with the impersonal persistence of something that doesn't know you're inside and wouldn't care if it did. On the third night, a sound like a slow crack traveled through the upper logs, and 4 of the children were in Lydia's room before she'd finished registering what she'd heard. "What was that?" Nora demanded. She was 9 and not easily frightened, which meant when she was frightened, it showed badly. "The cabin's settling," Lydia said, with more certainty than she felt. "It sounded like it was breaking. Wood contracts in the cold. It makes noise." "Why?" "Nora, get in the bed." Gideon appeared in the doorway to the main room, which surprised her. She'd thought he was asleep. He looked at the children piled in the doorway and then looked at the ceiling and listened for a moment. Then, "Top log on the north side. It does that. Happened once last winter." He addressed this to the room generally, not to anyone in particular, which was somehow more reassuring than if he'd been trying to be reassuring. "It's fine." "How do you know?" Nora said. "Because I built the cabin," Gideon said, "and I built it to hold." Nora looked at him with the assessing expression she applied to everything. Then she turned and went back to her room without further comment. Hannah and May followed her. Will lingered. "Can I see the stove?" Will asked. "It's 2 a.m, Lydia said. "I just want to see it's still going." Gideon looked at the boy for a moment. Will was 8, with a round face and his father's ears and an anxiety about fire that Lydia had always assumed was just a childhood phase, but was beginning to suspect was something more durable. He needed to see the stove was lit. He needed the visible proof of warmth. "Come on," Gideon said. He walked back to the main room and Will padded after him, and Lydia heard Gideon open the stove door and heard him say, quietly, "There. See? Good and hot. Going all night," and heard Will's small sigh of relief. When she checked a few minutes later, Will was back in his room. She stood in the doorway of the main room for a moment, looking at Gideon on his cot by the stove, already settled back to sleep, or nearly so. She thought about what it would have cost him to do that. Not the doing of it, which was small, but the knowing to do it. How a man learned to notice what a frightened 8-year-old needed at 2 in the morning without being asked. She didn't say anything. She went back to her room. By the 3rd week, a kind of rhythm had taken hold. Fragile, and not without friction, but there. The older boys split firewood in the morning under Gideon's supervision, a task that Thomas had initially approached with territorial pride and had since become genuinely competent at, though he didn't allow himself to show satisfaction about it. Nora had appointed herself the keeper of the food stores, a self-granted authority that Lydia allowed because Nora's tracking of what they had and what they were using was actually more accurate than her own. May and Hannah helped with meals and cleaning in ways that were more helpful than not, which was more than Lydia had expected from a 6- and 7-year-old. Will was the project that occupied her most. He was a bright boy who had always been quieter than his siblings, and the move had made him quieter still. He stayed close to the cabin, close to her, and had a persistent habit of appearing at her elbow when she wasn't expecting him, just to be near someone. She did not discourage this. She let him help with whatever she was doing, kneading bread dough, mending a shirt, even the tedious work of sorting through the dried beans to pick out the bad ones, and found that he worked alongside her in a contented silence that was its own kind of communication. One afternoon, Gideon came in from checking the upper trap line and found Will at the table, methodically sorting beans while Lydia worked at the stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment, snow still on his shoulders, and looked at the boy. "Will," he said. Will looked up. "You want to learn to tie a snare?" Will stared at him. Then he looked at Lydia. "Go ahead," she said. They were outside for 2 hours. When they came back in, Will had the slightly dazed expression of someone who has learned something that opened a door he didn't know was there. He sat down at the table and picked up the beans again without being asked, but there was something different in his posture. At dinner he said, out of nowhere, "A snare has to be the right height, or the animal walks under it." "That's right," Gideon said, "and you have to think about which direction they're coming from." "What else?" Will thought about it. "You have to not touch the ground around it with your bare hands, because they smell you." Gideon looked at him. "You were paying attention." Will looked back at him, and for the first time since they'd come up the mountain, he smiled like he meant it. Lydia noticed, around the end of the 3rd week, that the thing she'd been braced for hadn't happened. She'd been waiting for the seams to show, waiting for the moment when whatever held Gideon Hale's offer together would begin to fray. She'd been watching for impatience, for irritation, for the particular resentment of a man who has discovered that what he agreed to is not what he imagined. She'd cataloged every shortened response, every moment of quiet, every instance of him going outside to do something alone, and she'd waited for these to compound into something that would tell her she'd made a mistake. They didn't compound. They were just what he was like, a man who spent a lot of time in his own head, who preferred doing things to talking about them, who went outside when he needed space and came back when he was ready and didn't make it anyone else's problem. She realized, in the middle of one evening while she was mending a tear in Jacob's sleeve, and Gideon was sitting across from her oiling a trap spring, and all 6 of the older children were in various states of sleep, or near sleep, in the back rooms. She was, without having planned it, beginning to trust him. Not completely. Not the way you trust someone you've known for years, whose record is long and clear, but in the limited, provisional way that trust starts, before there's enough evidence to call it certainty. The way you trust a floor you've tested carefully to hold your weight. He looked up from the trap and caught her looking at him. She didn't look away. "You're still watching me," he said. "I am." Still waiting for something to go wrong. I'm still making up my mind, she said honestly. He considered that. That's fair, he said, and went back to the trap. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with its particular mountain voice, low and restless, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and somewhere in the back rooms one of the children, she couldn't tell which, shifted in sleep and was quiet again. The snow that started falling that night didn't stop for 4 days. When it finally cleared, they were buried to the porch rail. The world had gone white and absolutely still in the way that only happens after a major storm, and Lydia stood on the porch in the cold morning air, looking out at the untouched white surface of the clearing, and felt something she hadn't felt since before Silas died. Something that was not happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it. Possibility. The sense of it. Faint and uncertain, but there. Behind her, she could hear Gideon inside already moving, building the fire back up, and the muffled voices of the children beginning the complicated process of waking, and Clara making the small, determined sounds that meant she wanted to eat, and the ordinary machinery of the morning beginning to turn. She stood there a moment longer in the cold, and the white, and the quiet. Then she went back inside. The 4-day storm had changed something about how the mountain felt to them. Before it, the wilderness outside the cabin had been a backdrop, present, cold, acknowledged, but held at a certain distance by the warmth of the stove and the routine they were building. After it, when Gideon and Thomas spent the better part of a morning shoveling out the porch and the path to the woodpile and the entrance to the root cellar, and when the children stood looking at snow that came up past Will's waist in the clearing, the mountain became something they had to reckon with directly. Not as scenery, as a fact. Gideon seemed to understand this shift without being told. That afternoon, after the shoveling was done and everyone had come inside to warm up, he spread a rough map on the table, hand-drawn, on the back of a piece of oilcloth, in the tight, careful lines of a man who makes tools he intends to actually use. "Gather around," he said. The children came. Even Thomas, who had been managing his proximity to Gideon with a careful informality, moved close enough to see. "This is the mountain," Gideon said. He touched the center of the map. "We're here. This line is the creek. It runs northeast in winter, slower, but it doesn't freeze through because of the spring below the ridge. This is the upper slope." His finger moved. "This is the tree line. Above it, the wind is different, unpredictable. You don't go above the tree line without telling me first, and you don't go alone. Anyone." He looked around the table as he said this last word, making sure it landed on everyone, including Thomas. "What's up there?" Martin asked. "Elk range. Some deer. Also drop-offs you can't see until you're already over them, and if the snow's been working a certain way, the surface can look solid and not be. I've lost footing twice up there. Once in summer." He said it matter-of-factly, not for effect. "The second time I had to dig myself out one-handed, so that's why." Martin looked at the map with the focused expression he reserved for things he was taking seriously. "Have you ever gone over?" "No, but I know men who have." Gideon didn't elaborate, which was somehow more effective than a story would have been. Nora, who had been studying the map with her arms crossed, said, "Why is this part blank?" She was pointing to the eastern quadrant of the oilcloth, where the lines thinned and stopped. "Because I haven't mapped it," Gideon said. "Why not?" "Because I don't go there." "Why not?" Nora again in exactly the tone that had been making adults tired since she learned to talk. "Because there's nothing there I need." He looked at her. "And because the terrain on that side is unstable in winter. Rock shelf under the snow, angles wrong for grip." He paused. "Same rule as the tree line. You don't go east of the second creek fork without telling me." Nora appeared to find this satisfactory. She was the kind of child who needed the reason, not just the prohibition. What followed over the next several weeks was something that didn't have a name, but that Lydia thought of privately as the mountain education, a sustained and unglamorous process by which her children learned the difference between surviving in a valley town and surviving above it. The lesson came in pieces, some of them deliberate, and some of them accidental, and some of them delivered by the mountain itself in ways that no human teacher could have arranged. Thomas was the one Gideon started with, and Lydia thought she understood why. Thomas was the oldest and the most resistant, which meant he was also the one who, if he came around, would make it easier for the others. It wasn't strategy exactly. She didn't think Gideon operated with that kind of calculation. But it was the kind of instinct a man develops from years of reading landscapes and knowing where to start. He took Thomas hunting for the first time on a clear morning in late February, when the temperature had come up slightly and the snow had a crust that would hold weight if you spread it right. They left before the rest of the house was awake, and Lydia heard them go, heard the soft, careful sound of the door, heard their boots on the porch steps, and lay in the dark for a while listening to the silence they left behind. They were gone 6 hours. When they came back, Thomas was carrying one end of a field-dress doe, and Gideon had the other end, and they came up the porch steps with the particular coordination of two people who have spent several hours working in proximity and have developed, without discussing it, a sense of each other's movement. Thomas's face was something Lydia hadn't seen on it in weeks. Not happy. He wasn't there yet, but alert. Lit up in some way that wasn't about mood, but about engagement. He'd been somewhere that required his full attention and his full effort, and it had taken everything he had, and he'd done it. She didn't say anything about that directly. She looked at the deer and said, "That's a good size." Shot was at 60 yards, Thomas said. Gideon said most men go 40. She looked at Gideon over Thomas's head. He was already untying the rope from the deer's legs, not looking at her, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile. "We'll eat well this week," she said. That night at dinner, Thomas talked, not about feelings, not about the shift Lydia had watched happen in him, but about the mechanics of the morning, the tracking, the wind direction, how Gideon had pointed out a depression in the snow that Thomas had walked right past, and that turned out to be where the doe had bedded the night before. He talked with his hands, which he almost never did, and Martin listened with his elbows on the table in the way she'd asked him not to 100 times and forgot to. This time, and Jacob asked questions at such a rapid pace that Thomas told him to slow down. He was getting to it. Gideon ate and said nothing, which was his way, but he listened in that particular manner of his that was different from inattention, the listening of someone who doesn't need to confirm his presence in a conversation by inserting himself into it. After dinner, Lydia washed the dishes and Gideon dried them, a division of labor they'd arrived at without discussion. When the children had gone to the back rooms, she said, without looking up from the pot she was scrubbing, "Whatever you said to him out there, it helped." "Didn't say much," Gideon said. "That's probably why it helped." He was quiet for a moment. "He's a good shot, natural. Needs to learn patience more than he needs to learn aim. He's like his father in that." She said it without thinking, and then felt the weight of it arrive. The past tense, the comparison, the particular sadness of watching a child be like a person who isn't there anymore. She kept scrubbing. Gideon set down the dried pot and picked up the next one and didn't say anything, which was the right choice. Oh. March came in hard and then softened slightly, the way March sometimes does at altitude. Not a true thaw, but a suggestion of one, the light lasting a little longer in the afternoons, the quality of it shifting from the flat white of deep winter toward something with more color in it. The children's moods lifted with the light, mostly. Will had begun spending his afternoons checking his own small trapline, 3 snares that Gideon had helped him set in the brush north of the woodpile. And he reported the results at dinner with a seriousness that made even Thomas stop eating to listen. He'd caught 2 rabbits in the first week, nothing in the second, then a rabbit, and what appeared to be a very indignant ermine that he'd released because, as he explained, it seemed like it had places to be. Hannah's foot had healed. May had decided, without informing anyone, that her primary occupation on the mountain was learning to bake bread, and she had undertaken this project with a focus that Lydia found both endearing and occasionally alarming, because May applied the same approach to measuring flour that she applied to everything else, which was confidence in inverse proportion to accuracy. The first 2 loaves were dense enough to use as doorstops. The third was better. By the fourth, she had developed a system, which she refused to explain to anyone, and which produced consistent results. "You should write it down," Lydia told her. "I have it in my head," May said, with the authority of a 6-year-old who has discovered competence. Nora, who had assigned herself the role of critic, tasted the 4th loaf and said, "It's good. The crust is still too thick on the bottom." "Nobody asked you," May said. "I'm telling you anyway." "Nora," Lydia said. "I'm trying to help her improve, Nora." This was In its way, the most normal thing that had happened since Silas died, two of her daughters arguing about bread in a mountain cabin. And Lydia felt the ordinary irritation of a mother refereeing siblings, and under it, quiet and solid, something like relief. Bummed. It was in the second week of March that Gideon told her he needed to go up. He said it at breakfast, in the practical tone he used for logistics. The same tone he'd used to tell her the root cellar latch was sticking or that the east-facing trapline needed resetting. "Supplies getting thinner," he said. "I need to go into the high country. 3 days, maybe 4. Lydia set down her coffee. "The Elk Range." "Yes. Above the tree line." "I'll stay below where I can, but the elk have moved up. It's that time of year." He looked at her directly. "You'll be fine here. You know the stove, you know the supplies, you know the trap lines near the cabin." "I'm not worried about us here," she said, which was mostly true. "I know the terrain," he said. "I've hunted that range 15 years. "And the mountain lion track we found last week?" He was quiet for a beat. "I'll be careful." She looked at him. "That's not the same as saying it's not there." "No," he said. "It's not." She wanted to argue against it and knew she didn't have grounds to. The food situation was real. She'd been watching Nora's tally marks on the food store shelf with increasing attention, and she knew that at 8 people eating through the tail end of winter, they were burning through supplies faster than one winter's hunting could replenish. The elk were the answer to that problem, and the elk were where Gideon said they were. "Thomas goes with you," she said. Gideon shook his head. "Not this trip. The terrain above the tree line isn't. I'm not asking." He looked at her. "He's not going above the tree line, but he can go to the upper slope with you and come back if you send him. He knows enough now." She held his eyes. "I need someone to come back and tell me you're all right." A silence. Then, carefully, "And if I'm not?" "Then Thomas comes back and tells me that, and I figure out what to do next." Her voice was steady. "But at least I know." He considered this for a long moment. She could see him weighing the logic of it against whatever instinct he had toward operating alone, toward not involving other people in the risks he took as a matter of private accounting. "All right," he said. "Thomas goes to the upper slope. I'll send him back from the tree line." Thomas, when told, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Okay," in a voice that was trying not to sound eager and mostly failing. They left on a clear morning. Thomas came back at midday, alone, with the report that Gideon had gone up through the trees and the weather was holding and he'd said 3 days. 3 days came and went. On the 4th day, Lydia checked the trail twice before noon, which she told herself was reasonable. On the 4th evening, she sat at the table after the children were in bed and listened to the wind and did not sleep well. On the 5th day, in the early afternoon, she heard something on the porch. The sound was wrong. Not the deliberate sound of someone arriving, but something dragged, labored, stopping and starting. She was at the door before she'd finished processing what she'd heard, and she pulled it open and the cold air hit her, and Gideon was on the porch, one hand gripping the rail, and the front of his coat was dark in a way that took her a moment to understand. Behind him, just visible at the edge of the clearing, was an elk. Enormous, field-dressed, half-buried in a drag sled made from lashed pine branches. "I'm all right," he said, which was the first thing he'd ever said to her that was clearly not true. She got under his arm without asking permission and got him through the door. Thomas had appeared from somewhere, she didn't register where, and took the other side, and together they got Gideon to the main room and onto the cot by the stove. When she got his coat open, she found the wound, deep lateral gash across his left ribs and side, roughly bandaged with strips of his own shirt, the bandaging doing its job but only barely. "Mountain lion," he said. "Upper slope, not above the tree line." He said this last part with a faint, grim precision, as if he wanted credit for at least that. "Stop talking," Lydia said. "I got the elk first," he said. "Gideon, I just wanted that noted." Thomas was standing very still near the stove, the color gone from his face. He was 14 and he had seen the wound and understood what it meant about the last 3 days. What Gideon had managed alone, injured, in the high country, to get himself and that elk back down the mountain. "Thomas," Lydia said, "boil water, a lot of it. And get the kit from the back shelf, the wooden box, third shelf down. Go. He went. She worked quickly and without wasted motion, which was not because she'd done this before, but because the alternative was to move slowly, and moving slowly wasn't available to her. She'd cleaned and closed wounds before. Silas had come home cut badly twice, and there had been a time when Thomas was 8 and ran into a fence post, and the gash above his eye had required her best careful work. But this was deeper and longer than either of those, and Gideon had been moving on it for better than a day, which meant it was angered and had been working against itself. She cleaned it. He made no sound except once, when the cloth reached the deepest part, and then it was just a sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth that was the least dramatic possible expression of what had to be considerable pain. "You should have come back when it happened," she said. "I had the elk down," he said. "Couldn't leave it." "The elk could have waited." "Elk doesn't wait. Something else finds it." "And you would have died up there to protect a carcass." He was quiet for a moment. "We need the meat, Lydia." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She wasn't sure he knew he'd done it. She finished cleaning the wound and reached for the needle. "This is going to be bad," she said. "I know. Bite down on something." "I'm fine." "Gideon." He bit down on the folded edge of his blanket. She was not a trained surgeon. Her stitches were not beautiful. But they were tight and even, and they held, and when she'd finished and tied off and cleaned the site again, he was pale and sweating and clearly at the edge of what he'd had left in him. "Sleep," she said. "The elk. Thomas will deal with the elk." She looked at Thomas, who was standing with the hot water basin, watching with enormous eyes. "Won't you, Thomas?" Thomas looked at Gideon. Something moved across his face, something complicated and unfinished that would take him a while to work out. "Yeah," he said. "I'll get Martin. We'll bring it in." Gideon's eyes closed. "The sled's got the rope still tied on," he said, to the ceiling. "Just pull straight." "I know," Thomas said. Within 30 seconds, Gideon was unconscious, which Lydia thought was the most honest testimony she'd had yet to how much he'd been running on sheer determination for the last 24 hours. The fever came that night. She had expected it. Wounds that have been moving and working for a day don't settle quietly. The body registers the insult and responds with heat, which is both the problem and the evidence the body is still fighting. She sat with him through the first night, checking his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead, replacing the cool cloth when it warmed, keeping the stove at a steady temperature that was neither too hot nor too cold. He talked sometimes. When the fever rose, nothing coherent, fragments that didn't connect. She didn't try to follow the words. She just kept the cloth cool and the fire right, and her hand near enough that when he reached for something in whatever the fever was showing him, she was there. Martin spelled her at 2 in the morning. She hadn't asked him to. She'd looked up and he was there in the doorway in his blanket, with the steady face he'd been wearing since the day they'd arrived on the mountain. "Go sleep," he said. "I'll wake you if it changes." "Martin, you don't have to—" "Mama." He said it the way she'd said Gideon's name earlier, with a quiet finality that ended the discussion. "Go sleep." She slept 3 hours. When she came back, Martin was sitting in the chair by the cot, watching Gideon's face with the focused attention he usually reserved for things he was trying to understand. "He said something a while ago," Martin said, "about the cabin, about building it." "What about it?" "He said he built the rooms so there'd be enough space." Martin paused. "Enough space for people, not for one person. He said he didn't know who." He looked at her. "Do you think he knew before we came?" Lydia looked at Gideon's face, fever-flushed and slack with the unguarded openness of sleep. The man who had stood in a Grange hall and made an offer that no one had been able to explain, not even himself, not really. "I think some people build towards something they don't have a name for yet," she said. Martin thought about this. "That's kind of sad, or kind of hopeful," she said, "depending on how it turns out." The fever broke on the second day in the afternoon. She knew it by the change in his breathing first, the quality of it shifting from shallow and fast to something slower and more deliberate, and then by the temperature of his skin when she put her hand to his forehead, which was still warm but differently so, damp rather than burning. His eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "How long?" he said. 2 days? He absorbed this. The elk.
Hanging in the smokehouse. Thomas and Martin processed it. She paused. Thomas worked 4 hours without being asked. Gideon was quiet. She could see him recalibrating, registering what had happened, what had been done, what he owed, and to whom. Good cut? He asked, meaning the deer. I have no idea, she said. I'm told it was done correctly. I took their word for it. I should check yet. You should stay on that cot for at least another day. I'm fine. You were stitched by a woman who learned on injuries significantly smaller than yours, and you ran a fever for 2 days. And if you tear those stitches open, I will be very irritated with you. She said this in the same tone she used with the children, which she was aware was pointed, and she didn't particularly care. 1 more day. He looked at her. Then he lay back down. 1 day, he said. What changed after that was not dramatic. It was not the kind of shift you could point to on a calendar. It happened the way trust accumulates, by addition of small things, one after another, until the weight of them is undeniable. Thomas began asking Gideon questions, not constantly, not in the needy way of a boy looking for a father figure, but in the straightforward way of someone who recognizes expertise and wants access to it. He asked about the reading of terrain, about which signs meant predators were active in a given area, about how to judge ice thickness on a frozen creek. Gideon answered all of it without ceremony, and the answers were complete. He didn't talk down to Thomas, didn't simplify things that didn't need simplifying. He talked to him the way one person talks to another who is capable of understanding. Thomas didn't comment on this directly, but one evening Lydia overheard him telling Martin something Gideon had explained to him about wind patterns and hunting timing, and he was repeating it verbatim, with care, the way you repeat something you consider worth preserving. Nora brought Gideon a piece of maize bread one afternoon without explanation, which from Nora was roughly equivalent to a formal declaration of goodwill. He ate it without comment and said, "Better than last week," which was as close to effusive as he got, and Nora went and told May immediately. Will checked his trap line every day and reported to Gideon the way a deputy reports to a sheriff, with detail and seriousness and a faint proprietary pride that was charming precisely because Will was 8 and didn't know he was being charming. Gideon listened to each report with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was the particular attention of a person who isn't waiting for you to finish talking. Clara, who was 10 months old and did not yet have opinions about the social dynamics of mountain survival, had decided that Gideon's beard was fascinating. She had grabbed it twice, and both times he'd held absolutely still with the expression of a man who has encountered a situation with no established protocol. Lydia watched this from across the room and said nothing, because some things you just let happen. Chug. On a night toward the end of March, when the worst of winter felt like it had finally peaked and was considering its retreat, Lydia sat on the porch after the children were in bed and looked out at the mountain. The sky was clear and the stars were close the way they only are at altitude, sharp-edged in particular, not the soft scattered light of the valley, but something more deliberate. The peaks to the north showed white against the dark, and the trees below them were black shapes, and the clearing in front of the cabin was that particular blue-white that snow gets under starlight. Gideon came out after a while and stood near the door, not sitting, not intruding on whatever she was doing, but present in the way he'd learned to be present, available without being insistent. "You should be inside," she said. "Your side." "Stitches are holding. I checked." He came and leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the same view. "Warmer tonight." "Relatively. Another week, maybe 2, the lower snowpack will start going. Won't reach us up here for a while, but you'll feel it in the air." She looked at the peaks. "And then spring. Such as it is up here." He was quiet for a moment. "Not like valley spring, but there's a week in May where it's worth it." She looked at him. "You're telling me there's something to look forward to." He looked back at her. "I'm telling you the mountain's not just winter." She held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment she thought about the Grange Hall, and the snow, and the porch steps with Thomas waiting for her, and the ride up through the trees, and 2 nights sitting up with a fever, and May's bread, and Will's serious face, and Thomas talking with his hands at dinner, and all the small, unremarkable, and completely irreplaceable things that had accumulated in the weeks since they'd come up this mountain. "I know that now," she said. The wind moved through the pines below them, a long, slow sound like something breathing.
They stood there in the cold for a while, not talking, the cabin warm behind them, the mountain quiet and enormous all around. Gideon had been right about May. It arrived the way he'd described it, not with the dramatic announcement of Valley Spring. No sudden warmth, no overnight transformation, but with a gradual and specific shift in the quality of everything. The light first coming in at a lower angle that caught the south face of the cabin and held there longer in the mornings. Then the sound. The snowmelt running in the creek below the clearing, a sound that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago and was now constant, underneath everything, like the mountain had found its pulse again. Then the smell, which was the thing Lydia hadn't anticipated, pine resin warming in the afternoon sun, something green and mineral rising from the earth where the snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes, the particular clean cold of air that is losing its edge. May noticed it first, because May noticed things that happened to her senses before she noticed anything else. She came inside one afternoon with her coat unbuttoned and her face tipped up and said, "It smells different," with the satisfaction of someone whose observation has just been confirmed. "Spring," Lydia said. "Is it always like this up here?" "I don't know," Lydia said. "This is my first one." May considered this, apparently finding it remarkable that there was something her mother was experiencing for the first time. She went back outside. The children had changed in ways that Lydia was still cataloging. Thomas was the most visible change. He'd grown, she thought, though it was hard to tell with a 14-year-old whether it was height or just the way he carried himself differently now. He moved through the outdoor work with competence rather than effort, which was the distinction between someone learning a thing and someone who has learned it. He still had the watchfulness, still the edge that grief and responsibility had put on him, but it sat differently on him now, less like armor and more like just how he was built. Martin had found his way back to talking, which she'd been patient about and was now glad of. He talked at dinner, asked questions during the day, had developed a specific interest in the geography of the mountain that Gideon was feeding with the focused investment of a man who has waited a long time for someone to be interested in the things he knows. She'd found them bent over the oilcloth map twice in the past week, Gideon adding lines to the blank eastern section that had worried Nora back in February, Martin asking about each one. Will's trapline had expanded to 7 snares, which he maintained with a seriousness that would not have looked out of place in a much older person. He'd taught himself, through trial and the kind of error that doesn't discourage you if you're genuinely interested, how to reset a sprung snare without leaving scent, and he'd explained this improvement to Gideon one evening in such technical detail that Gideon had listened to the whole thing and then said, "That's right. Where'd you figure that out?" And Will had said, "I thought about what you said about the ermine that time, about how they can smell everything, and I just tried different things until it worked." The look on Gideon's face during this exchange was one Lydia filed away without comment. The girls had built something she could only describe as a domestic civilization in the corner of the back room they shared, a system of organization for their small possessions that had its own internal logic, a rotating schedule for who slept on which side of the cot, and an ongoing project involving pressed plants that May had started collecting from the edges of the snowmelt, and Hannah was flattening between the pages of the one book Lydia had brought from Aldworth. None of this was easy. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because there was a temptation as the cold eased to look back at the winter with a softness it didn't deserve. The days had been long and hard, and the quarters cramped, and there had been arguments about blankets and shelf space, and who had eaten more than their share of the molasses that escalated to a pitch she would not have thought possible in a space that size. Jacob had broken a tool Gideon needed during a particularly clumsy moment in the woodshed and spent an entire day in an agony of guilt before Gideon told him, with the plainness that was his habitual mode, that it was a tool and tools could be fixed, and that was what tools were for. Nora had a period of 2 weeks in late February where she'd been impossible to be around. Short-tempered, critical of everything, prone to sudden silences that were worse than the criticism. And it had taken Lydia longer than she liked to recognize that Nora was grieving, specifically and quietly and in her own untranslatable language, for the life they'd left behind. She'd sat with Nora one night and not tried to fix it, just sat there with her daughter in the narrow bunk and let Nora lean against her shoulder and be sad without being asked to explain or improve. And Nora had cried for about 10 minutes and then stopped and said, "I miss the Halverson girl." And Lydia had said, "I know." And that had been more or less the end of that particular crisis. Not resolved, just moved through.
Gideon's stitches had healed eventually into a ridge of scar tissue along his left ribs that he didn't mention and that Lydia knew about only because she'd been the one to put them in. He'd been back at full capacity within 2 weeks of the fever breaking, though she'd watched him carefully for another week after that for signs of anything she'd missed.
There was a period of 3 or 4 days when he favored his left side without appearing to know he was doing it, and when she pointed this out, he'd said, "It pulls when I reach," and she'd said, "Then stop reaching with it until it stops pulling," and he'd said, "I can't always arrange that," and she'd given up because some arguments with this man were just the shape of a wall, and she was learning to identify them faster. Well, it was in the second week of May that Harmon Fitch rode up the mountain. He brought 2 men with him, Dale Gruber, Walt's older brother, and a man Lydia didn't recognize who turned out to be a county assessor named Pritchard, who had ridden out from the territorial seat. 3 horses on the upper trail, moving slow through the last of the mud season. Thomas spotted them from the woodpile and came to the door without running, which was its own evidence of how he'd changed. "Men coming up the trail," he said. 3 of them. Fitch is one. Lydia was at the stove. She set down what she was holding and looked at Gideon, who was at the table with the trap inventory. "How far?" Gideon said. 10 minutes, maybe." Gideon set down the inventory and stood. He looked at Lydia. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a plan, more like a shared understanding of what this visit probably meant and how they intended to receive it. "I'll go out," Lydia said. "I'll be with you." "I know." She went to the back room first and told the children to stay inside, which she said in the tone that meant this was not a suggestion. Then she went out to the porch with Gideon, and they stood there and waited while the 3 riders came out of the tree line and across the clearing. Fitch looked older than she remembered, or maybe it was just the contrast with everything that had happened since she'd last seen him. He was big and gray-bearded, and he sat his horse with the unconscious authority of a man used to being the largest figure in any situation. He took in the cabin, the woodpile, the clearing, the 2 people standing on the porch, in a single slow survey that she could see was working against his expectations. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Fitch." She kept her voice even. "You've come a long way." "I have." He dismounted and the other 2 followed. "Mind if we talk?" "Depends on what about," she said. Fitch paused, which she thought he probably didn't do often. He looked at her and then at Gideon and then back at her. "Can we come up?" She stepped back from the doorway in answer. "Hotz." The 3 men sat at the table. Lydia poured coffee because it was what you did regardless of the circumstances, and she sat across from Fitch with her hands around her own cup, and Gideon stood near the stove because there weren't enough chairs, and also, she thought, because standing was where he preferred to be in situations like this. Pritchard, the assessor, had his papers out before anyone had finished sitting down. A man who communicated his purpose through props. "The county has some questions about the claim on this property," Pritchard said. He had the voice of someone who delivers unwelcome information so regularly it stopped meaning anything to him personally. "Specifically regarding long-term occupancy and whether the original settlement filing covers the additions." "The original filing covers the land," Gideon said. "I filed it 14 years ago with the territorial office. The structures on it are mine by improvement. The additions built in the last 3 years are attached to the original structure and fall under the same claim." Pritchard made a note. "There's also the question of the family." He glanced at Lydia in a way that managed to be professionally impersonal and vaguely insulting simultaneously. "The nature of the arrangement." "The nature of the arrangement," Lydia said, "is that Mr. Hale offered shelter to my family during a crisis, and we accepted." "Informally," Pritchard said. "Yes." "The county's concern is the welfare of the children," Fitch said. He'd been quiet up to this point, watching. "That's the substance of it, Mrs. Mercer. There were concerns raised about the arrangement, about whether this was a suitable environment." "By whom?" she said. Fitch shifted. "By several members of the community. The same community that voted to split my children among 6 households because it was convenient." She said it without heat, which was more effective than saying it with heat would have been. "I remember the arithmetic." "That isn't—" Fitch stopped. Tried again. "The concern is legitimate. 7 children. Remote location. A man who, he glanced at Gideon, who lives outside the normal bounds of the community. Outside your view of what's normal, Gideon said from the stove. Fitch looked at him. They'd had some version of this conversation before, Lydia could tell. The specific flatness with which two men look at each other when the territory between them has already been mapped. I'd like to see the children, Pritchard said. Lydia looked at him. Why? To confirm their welfare. You can see their welfare, she gestured at the room around them. The shelves, the stove, the order of things, the evidence of a household that was functioning. This is a home. My children are fed, they are warm, they are learning, they are together. Which is exactly what I said they would be when I stood in that Grange hall 4 months ago. Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Pritchard, she set down her coffee cup. I'm not going to produce my children for inspection so that men who tried to give them away can satisfy themselves that I made the right decision without their help. She paused. But they're in the back rooms if you'd like to see that they exist. A silence. Then from the back hallway, because it had apparently gotten too quiet for at least one person to tolerate. Is someone here? Nora's voice, clear as a struck bell. Stay back, Nora, Lydia said. I'm not in the way. I'm just asking, Nora. A pause. Then footsteps retreating, imperfectly. Fitch, to his credit, looked like a man who was beginning to understand that he was losing this conversation by a wider margin than he'd arrived expecting. He looked around the room again. The stocked shelves, the orderly surfaces, the evidence everywhere of a household that had not merely survived but organized itself. And he had the expression of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out differently than they expected. The situation on the land claim, Pritchard said, returning to his papers with the persistence of a man who needs to feel he has accomplished something, still requires clarification. What clarification? Gideon said. The additions. I told you. Original filing. I have the papers inside if you want to look at them. Pritchard blinked. You have the original filing documents. I have everything I've ever signed. Filing papers, improvement records, the survey from 11 years ago. I keep my records. He said this without particular emphasis, as a fact about himself, but it landed with a weight that Pritchard visibly registered. A man who keeps his records is a man who knows what the records show. I'd like to see them, Pritchard said. Gideon went to the back shelf and produced a wooden box, the same box Lydia had seen but never opened, and from it he extracted a folded set of papers and spread them on the table. They were old but intact, the territorial seals still visible, the boundary markers listed in careful columns. Pritchard studied them in a silence that became, by degrees, the silence of a man finding nothing wrong. Fitch sat with his coffee and said nothing. After 20 minutes with the papers, Pritchard folded them and slid them back across the table and said he thought the filing was probably sufficient, which was the least gracious version of "you're right" that Lydia had ever heard, and made a note in his ledger that she didn't ask to read. I want to see the children before we go, Fitch said. Not Pritchard this time. Fitch himself, and in a different tone, quieter, with something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not for any official reason, I'd like to. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face, under the authority and the gray beard and the bluster that had filled the Grange Hall back in February, that she recognized as a man who has been sitting with something uncomfortable and hasn't fully worked through it yet. All right, she said. She went to the back hallway. All of you, come out. They came. Thomas first, then Martin, then Jacob with his careful hands, then Nora with her arms crossed, then Will, who had dirt on his face from the trap line, then Hannah and May together, May carrying a piece of bread because she'd apparently been eating when they were called, and Clara on Lydia's hip, who looked at the assembled adults with the sovereign indifference of an 11-month-old who has not yet learned to be impressed by people. The silence that followed was the silence of a man confronted with evidence. Fitch looked at each of them. He looked at Thomas, who stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. He looked at the little ones, at May still holding her bread, at Will with his dirty face, at Hannah and her pressed plant book that she'd brought out for no apparent reason. He looked at Clara. He looked at Lydia. Then he looked at Gideon. Whatever he was looking for, He seemed to find it, or find the absence of what he'd feared, which amounted to the same thing. "They look well," he said. His voice had a roughness to it that hadn't been there before. "They look healthy." "They are healthy," Lydia said. Fitch nodded slowly. He set down his coffee cup. Then he said, with the evident effort of a man who doesn't apologize often and isn't sure he's doing it correctly, "I may have... The plan we put forward in January, it seemed like the only solution." "It wasn't," she said. "No." He looked at the table. "No, I can see that." "The problem," she said, "was that you were solving for their survival and not for their family. Those aren't the same problem." Fitch was quiet for a moment. He looked at Thomas again, 14 years old, straight-backed, watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone filing it away. "Your oldest boy," he said. "He's going to be something." "He already is something," Lydia said. Thomas's jaw moved just slightly. He looked at his boots for a moment and then back up. Fitch stood. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he set on the table. "From the community, several families. It won't change what you've built here. But it seemed right." He paused. "It's late, but it seemed right." Lydia looked at the envelope without picking it up. "The Halverson family," Fitch said. "And the Pollocks, Agnes's family, and a few others." She picked it up then. She didn't open it in front of them. "Thank you," she said. She said it not warmly, but honestly, which was the best she could do. The three men rode back down the mountain in the afternoon light, and the family watched them go from the porch, all 8 of them, which happened sometimes now without being arranged, all of them standing in a loose cluster and watching something together. When the riders disappeared into the trees, Nora said, "What was in the envelope?" "I haven't looked yet," Lydia said. "Can I—" "No. I'm just—" "Nora," Jacob said, "did they come to take us back?" Lydia looked at her third son, 11 years old, with his careful hands and his persistent worry about things going wrong. "No," she said. "They came to see if we were all right." "Are we?" She looked at the clearing, the woodpile, the south-facing wall of the cabin with the afternoon sun lying across it. She looked at Gideon, who was already moving off the porch toward the woodshed with the purposefulness of a man who has decided the conversation is over and there's work to do. "Yes," she said. "We are." Jacob nodded, satisfied, and went inside. She opened the envelope that evening after the children were asleep. $32 from 11 families, and a note in Agnes Pollock's handwriting that said simply, "We should have done more. I hope this helps with what comes next." $32 was not a fortune. It was also not nothing. She folded it and put it in the box on the back shelf, next to Gideon's land papers. She sat at the table for a while after that, in the way she'd sat at the table in the Aldworth cabin through the long winter nights, but differently, not with the arithmetic of desperation, but with the arithmetic of possibility, which is an entirely different kind of math. Gideon came in from the final check of the evening and saw her at the table and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, which was something he'd started doing in the last few weeks. Not always with conversation, sometimes just present. $32, she said. That's something. Agnes's note said they should have done more. He was quiet. She's right, Lydia said. They should have. But I think some people need to see the evidence before they can understand what they should have done. Most people, Gideon said. Including me, she said. I needed to see this cabin before I could trust it, before I could trust you. She paused. I needed the evidence. He looked at her across the table. And now? She thought about it honestly, about the things that were still hard, the cramped space, the ongoing negotiation, the grief that was still in this family and wouldn't be finished for a long time, the mornings when she woke up and reached for the fact of Silas before remembering it wasn't there, about the things that had been built in spite of all of that, the 7 children in the back rooms, sleeping, the elk in the smokehouse, Thomas talking with his hands, Will's trapline, May's bread, Nora's pressed plant book, which had turned out to be Hannah's project that Nora had taken over and improved, and was now both of theirs. Now I know what I'm trusting, she said. That's different from not being afraid. But it's better. Gideon looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he had, the listening that was also a kind of stillness. I've been thinking about the East Edition, he said. The unfinished room. What about it? I want to finish it before next winter, get it properly chinked, put in a window if I can source the glass. It could be a real room. He paused. It would give the girls more space, and Thomas could have a space of his own instead of sharing with the younger boys. She considered this. That's a significant amount of work. I know. Thomas would help. I know? Martin, too. He's been asking about construction. I know. She looked at him. You've thought this through already. I think about things for a while before I say them, he said. I've noticed. He was quiet again, the specific quiet of someone who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. She'd learned to wait for it. I've been thinking about the spring planting too, he said, the south-facing slope below the clearing. It gets enough light. If we clear it properly and build up the soil over the summer… Gideon. He looked at her. You're talking about next winter, she said. And the summer after it. Yes. That's a long time. He met her eyes. I know what I'm building toward, he said. Now. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Somewhere outside, the creek ran its new spring sound through the dark. Lydia sat across from this man who had built rooms for people he didn't know yet, and she felt the word home arrive in her the way it sometimes arrives, not announced, not chosen, but simply present, settled into the space where the hollow had been. Tell me about the slope, she said. He told her. They sat at the table for another hour, talking about soil and light and what would grow at altitude and what wouldn't. And the conversation was practical and detailed and entirely about the future. And outside the mountain held them in its enormous quiet, indifferent as always but no longer strange, no longer something to be endured. Just the place where they lived. The south-facing slope turned out to be better soil than either of them had expected. Gideon had warned her it might be rocky. Too much shale in the upper layer, he'd said, the kind of ground that resists a shovel and has opinions about being disturbed. But when they cleared the snow-killed brush in the first warm week of May and turned the first row with the iron spade, what came up was dark and loamy underneath the top crust, the kind of earth that had been composting itself under pine needles for decades without anyone asking it to. Lydia drove the spade in and levered it up and looked at what came with it and said, Gideon. He came over and crouched down and picked up a handful and rubbed it between his fingers the way she'd seen him do with everything he was assessing. The same gesture he used on wood grain, on snow texture, on the consistency of dried meat. He let it fall. Good, he said, which from him was the equivalent of enthusiasm. Thomas and Martin did most of the heavy clearing. They worked without being asked in the particular way that had become characteristic of both of them now. Not cheerfully, not with performance, but steadily, the way people work when they've decided a thing is worth doing and don't need anyone to confirm it. Thomas had developed shoulders over the winter, not just muscle, but the posture that comes from months of real physical work, and watching him swing a mattock at the root systems of the cleared brush. Lydia had the strange double vision that parents get sometimes, seeing the 14-year-old in front of her and the man he was becoming, both at once, and feeling the mix of pride and grief that comes with watching a child outgrow their grief by growing into themselves. Jacob helped with the lighter clearing and managed not to break anything for almost 2 weeks, which was a record, and which Lydia noted privately without saying anything because pointing it out seemed like the kind of thing that would jinx it. By the end of May, they had a plot cleared, roughly 40 feet by 20, terraced slightly where the slope required it. The soil turned and worked and left to breathe. Not planted yet. Too early at that altitude for most things. But ready. What goes in first? Nora asked, standing at the edge of the plot with her arms crossed and her expression that said she was prepared to have opinions. Potatoes, Gideon said. Then turnips. Then whatever the season gives us time for. Can we do beans? Pole beans, if we build the frame before June. Nora looked at the plot with the assessing expression she applied to everything. I can build the frame, she said. Gideon looked at her. Do you know how? No, but I can learn. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his face that was not quite a smile, but had the same quality in it,
said that he found this response satisfactory. "I'll show you," he said. Nora learned to build a bean frame. She also learned over the course of that summer to plant in rows that respected the angle of the sun, to identify which seedlings were worth keeping and which were competing with something stronger, and to thin a planting with the ruthless practicality that gardening requires and that suited her temperament exactly. She was not a gentle gardener. She was an effective one. The East Addition took longer than planned because construction at altitude always takes longer than planned, and because 3 of the people helping were children who were learning the skill at the same time they were applying it, which is efficient in the long run and inefficient in the present tense. Gideon had drawn it out on a piece of paper one evening. Not an architect's drawing, just a practical sketch, dimensions and materials, and gone over it with Thomas and Martin the way he went over everything. Complete, without condescension, including the parts that might go wrong and how to handle them when they did. Thomas had asked good questions. Martin had asked better ones, and Gideon had given him a look that meant he was being assessed and said, "You think like a builder." And Martin had said, "I think like someone who's worried about things falling down." And Gideon had said, "Same thing," which seemed to please Martin more than a direct compliment would have. The framing went up in 3 days. The chinking took 2 weeks because it had to be done right. Lydia worked on it alongside the boys, learning the mix and the application by ruining a section of the south wall on her second attempt and having to scrape it out and start again, which she did without complaining, and with the specific internal irritation of someone who expects more from themselves than a learning curve allows. "You're pushing too hard," Gideon said, watching her work. "I know I am." It needs to go in soft, then firm up in place." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You do this thing when you're frustrated. You go faster instead of slower." She stopped and looked at him. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation. Those are sometimes the same thing." "Sometimes," he agreed. He came and showed her the pressure again, the angle of the knife, the amount of material, the pace that let the chinking settle into the gap rather than fighting it. She watched and then tried again, and it was better. She was not going to say it was better out loud while he was standing there, but it was better. "You do the same thing," she said when she'd done another section. "What thing?" "Go faster when it's not working." She glanced at him. "When the snare line kept coming up empty in March. You were out there twice a day." He thought about this. "That's different." "It's really not." He made a sound that wasn't agreement, but wasn't disagreement either, which was his version of conceding a point. The window glass was the problem she'd known it would be. You couldn't source glass at altitude. You had to send for it, which meant going down to Aldworth, which neither of them had done since January. The question of going back into the valley had been present for weeks without being directly discussed, the way some questions live in a household without anyone raising them, each person aware of it and waiting for someone else to bring it up first. Lydia brought it up first, because that was how things got done. "I need to go down," she said one evening. It was June, the long light of near summer still in the sky at 7 in the evening, the clearing outside warm enough that May had eaten her dinner on the porch steps. Gideon looked up from the trap inventory. "Window glass," she said, "and seed stock for next year. And I want to see Agnes Pollock." "I'll go." "I want to go," she said. "These are my people. Or they were." She paused. "I need to know what that is now." He understood this. She could see that he understood it. "Thomas can go with you," he said. "I was going to take Thomas, and Will, actually. I think Will needs to see that the valley is still there." Gideon nodded. "I'll write down what I need from the general store." "I assumed you would." They rode down on a Tuesday morning, the 3 of them, Lydia, Thomas, and Will, who sat his horse with a concentration that betrayed the fact that he was still not entirely at ease on horseback, but was determined not to show it. The trail down felt shorter than it had going up, which was always how it was. The familiar makes itself smaller. Aldworth looked the same. Of course it did. It had been 5 months, not 5 years. But it felt different to Lydia. The way a place feels when you've left it under pressure and come back having survived what you left for. The street, the Grange Hall, the general store, the line of buildings against the flat valley sky, she registered all of it with a detachment she hadn't expected. Not coldness,
just distance. The kind of perspective that opens up when you've been living somewhere that makes ordinary concerns look smaller. Agnes Pollock saw her coming from 50 yards away and was out the door of the post station before Lydia had dismounted. Lydia Mercer. She looked her over in the thorough way of a woman who is checking something specific. You look different. I am different, Lydia said. Different how? Lydia thought about it honestly. Harder, she said, and less worried. Those two things are related, I think. Agnes laughed. A real one, the kind she didn't produce for social purposes. She looked at Thomas, who had tied the horses and was standing with his hands in his pockets, and she said, Thomas, you've grown. I work outside a lot, Thomas said, which was not the most gracious response but was accurate. Agnes looked at Will, who was examining the post station's exterior wall with the focused interest he applied to anything structural since the conversation he'd had with Gideon about how buildings stay standing. And this one, Agnes said, still counting everything? I'm looking at how they did the corner joint, Will said without looking up. It's not as tight as ours. Agnes looked at Lydia with an expression that mixed amusement with something warmer. Come inside, she said. I'll put coffee on. The conversation with Agnes was the kind that starts practical and goes somewhere else by the second cup. Agnes had heard about Fitch's visit to the mountain, had in fact helped organize the envelope. She said this without seeking credit for it, just as information. She said that the town's general feeling had shifted over the winter. Not completely, not uniformly, because towns don't do anything uniformly, but that the question of whether Lydia had made a mistake had been more or less settled by the fact that she'd survived it, and that several of the families who'd been loudest about placing the children had gone quiet in a way that was probably as close to an apology as they were going to produce. Fitch told Walt Gruber that your cabin was better provisioned than half the homesteads in the valley, Agnes said. Walt told his wife told everyone. Lydia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. And Gideon? What do they say about Gideon? Agnes was quiet for a moment. That depends on who you ask, she said carefully. Some people still think... She stopped. Some people don't change their opinion of a man just because the facts suggest they should. I know. But others... Agnes paused. There are people in this town who think what he did was the most decent thing anyone in the valley has done in 10 years. That's also a real thing. Lydia looked at the table. He doesn't need the valley's opinion, she said. He never has. No, Agnes said, but you might, sometimes. This was the thing Agnes always did, the thing that made her harder to talk to and more worth talking to than almost anyone else. She went to the thing under the surface of what you were actually saying. I'm not going back, Lydia said. That's what you're asking, isn't it? Whether I'm going back. I'm asking what you've decided. I've decided that my children are healthy and together and learning things on that mountain that they couldn't learn anywhere else, and that the man we're living with is... She stopped, started again. He is not what they said he was. What is he? Lydia looked at her old friend. He's someone who built rooms he didn't need, she said, and waited without knowing what he was waiting for, and when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. She paused. That's a kind of faith I don't have a better word for. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Are you happy, Lydia? The question was direct enough that it required the same in return. I don't know if happy is the right word, she said. I'm purposeful. I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I can see what it's making. That's more than I had in January. Agnes nodded slowly. She seemed to accept this as an honest answer, which it was. They went to the general store for supplies, and Lydia negotiated with the storekeeper over glass panes with a firmness that Thomas watched from the side of the room with visible approval. They got 2 good panes and a third that was slightly warped but serviceable, and enough seed stock for a second year's garden, and the particular kind of salt pork that Gideon had written on his list with a specificity that suggested he'd been thinking about it. On the way back through the main street, 3 people stopped to speak to her. 2 were brief and careful, the kind of conversation that acknowledges something without naming it. The third was Mrs. Halverson, who had left bread on her doorstep in January, and who now put both hands on Lydia's arms and said, I think about those children every week. Are they truly all right? With an urgency that came from real feeling. They are, Lydia said. All of them? The baby? Clara's walking now. She's been walking for 6 weeks. Lydia said it before she'd finished processing what she was saying, and then felt it arrive. The fact of it, the ordinary miracle of an 11-month-old becoming a 12-month-old on a mountain, taking her first steps on a plank floor in front of a stove, reaching for Gideon's beard for balance. "She's fine," she said. "They're all fine." Mrs. Halverson's eyes went bright in the way of women who feel things in the front of their faces. "Tell them we think of them," she said. "I will," Lydia said. She meant it. Mom. The ride back up the mountain was quieter than the ride down. Will fell asleep in the saddle for 20 minutes somewhere in the middle section of the trail, a feat that Lydia noted with impressed alarm and that Thomas managed by riding close enough to catch him if he listed too far. When Will woke up, he was completely disoriented for about 4 seconds and then said, as if continuing a conversation, "Do you think the third snare moved?" "What?" Thomas said. "I set it by the birch root, but the ground was soft. I think it might have moved." "Then you'll check it when we get back," Lydia said. Will nodded and was fully awake immediately, the way children are. One switch, no in between. Thomas rode beside her for a while in the comfortable silence they'd developed, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then he said, without particular preamble, "Do you think we're staying? For good?" She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his profile against the trees, her husband's jaw, her own eyes, something that was entirely his own in the set of his mouth. "Yes," she said. "Okay," he said. They rode on for a minute. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah." "Is that all right with you?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was what she'd always appreciated about him, even when it drove her mad. The fact that he didn't give you the easy answer. "I miss Papa," he said. "I'll always miss Papa. That's not going away." "No," she said. "It's not. But up here," he paused, "I feel like I'm doing something, not just existing somewhere, doing something." He glanced at her. "Gideon said yesterday that I have good instincts for tracking, that you can teach technique, but you can't teach instinct. He's right. He doesn't say things like that unless he means them." "No," she said. "He doesn't." Thomas was quiet again. Then, "I don't think of him as, I'm not trying to replace Papa. That's not what it is." "I know," she said. "He's just," Thomas searched for it. "He's someone I want to learn from. That's its own thing." Lydia looked at her son on his horse on a mountain trail in June, and she thought, this is what surviving looks like when it works. Not the absence of loss, not the erasure of what came before. Just this. A boy becoming someone his father would have recognized and someone his father never anticipated, both at once, on a trail leading home. "That's a good thing, Thomas," she said. "That's exactly what it should be." Summer on the mountain was not the brutal suspension of winter, but it was not easy either. The altitude made everything a calculation. The window of planting, the window of harvest, the particular risks of a late frost that could take a whole bed of seedlings in a single night if you'd miscalculated the season. Gideon had spent 14 years learning that calendar. He taught it to them the way he taught everything, through doing, through attention, through the gradual accumulation of knowing what to watch for. The garden was Lydia's primary project through June and July. It was bigger than anything she'd managed in Aldworth, and more demanding, and some things failed. The first planting of beans came up sparse and yellow, and she had to replant with the pole frame Nora had built, which worked better, but set them back 2 weeks. The turnips were successful in a way that surprised even Gideon. The potatoes went in and disappeared underground for what felt like too long before the first green showed, and the week before they did, Will had been checking the plot every morning with the expression of someone waiting for news. "They'll come," Gideon told him. "How do you know?" "Because I put them in right and the soil's good and I haven't made a mistake yet with potatoes in 14 years. "Yet," Will said. Gideon looked at him. "Yet," he agreed. Will seemed to find this more reassuring than a guarantee would have been, which said something about what he'd learned over the winter about the difference between honesty and comfort. The potatoes came up the following Tuesday. Will knocked on the cabin door to report it with a gravity that made Nora roll her eyes, and May say, "I knew they would," as if she'd had inside information.
The East Edition was finished in August. Gideon put the last of the chinking in on a Thursday afternoon, and Thomas climbed up to check the roofline joints and came down and said, "It's solid," with the confidence of someone who now knew what solid meant and could verify it. The window, the two good panes and the warped one, were set in the west-facing wall of the new room, which Gideon had given to the girls, reasoning that the morning light on the east side would be too much for sleeping and that the girls were more likely to appreciate an afternoon view than the boys, who would be outside by then anyway. May's reaction to having a room with windows was the most extreme. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, looking at the light coming through the glass and landing on the plank floor, and she said, "You can see the trees from the bed." Then she said, "Can I paint the walls?" "With what?" Nora said. May thought about this. "We could make something. You can't just make paint." "You can, actually," said Martin from the doorway, with the tone of someone who has been reading too much and is ready to prove it. "You can use clay and oil. I read about it in—" "Nobody asked you, Martin," Nora said. "Nora," Lydia said. "I'm just Nora." The walls were not painted, but the room was finished, and the girls moved into it with the organizational thoroughness Lydia had come to expect from them. The system of shelves, the division of the two cots, the pressed plant project now taking up an entire wall in a way that had transformed from a hobby into something that genuinely resembled an intention. Hannah had been pressing and labeling plants since February. She had 43 specimens by August, each one labeled in her small, careful handwriting with the name Gideon had told her and the date and where she'd found it. Gideon had looked at the collection one afternoon while Hannah watched him from across the room. "You're missing the yellow one from the upper creek," he said. "I couldn't find one that wasn't damaged," Hannah said. "I'll show you where they grow thick. Other side of the ridge, sheltered spot, better specimens." He looked at her. "You want to go next week?" Hannah looked at him with 8-year-old seriousness. "Yes," she said. They went the following Wednesday, just the two of them, and came back 2 hours later with 6 pressed specimens wrapped carefully in cloth, and Hannah spent the entire dinner explaining the differences between them while everyone ate and most of them listened, and May fell asleep before dessert. It was in late August, on an evening when the first edge of coming fall was in the air, just barely, just a suggestion in the temperature after sundown, that Lydia understood something she'd been circling for weeks without landing on directly. She was sitting on the porch after the younger children were in bed, which had become her habit in the evenings. The time of day she kept for herself. The mountains to the north held the last of the light along their peaks, orange and then pink, and then the particular gray-blue of high-altitude dusk. The trees below the clearing were already in shadow. The creek was loud tonight. It always got louder in the evenings, or maybe she just heard it better when everything else was quieter. Gideon came out and sat in the other chair. He'd made 2 chairs over the winter, rough-hewn but solid, set at an angle to each other on the porch. And they were quiet together for a while in the way they'd gotten comfortable with. The particular companionship of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to each other. She had been thinking about Silas. She did this less than she had in February, not because he mattered less, but because grief changes its shape over time. It becomes less of a presence you're always bracing against and more of something you carry, something you know the weight of. She thought about the last morning she'd seen him alive, which had been an ordinary morning. Breakfast and the usual argument about whether Jacob needed new boots yet, and Silas saying he'd look at them when he got back. The way you say things when you assume there will be a back to come to. She thought about the fact that she had 7 children with her on a mountain, fed and sleeping, all of them in the same place, all of them intact in the ways that mattered. She thought about Thomas's shoulders and Will's snares, and May's bread, and Hannah's plant collection, and Nora's bean frame, and Martin's maps, and Clara, who was walking now and had opinions about everything and had recently developed the habit of bringing Gideon things, pebbles, sticks, one alarming occasion a beetle, and offering them with the solemn intentionality of a child who has decided someone deserves her gifts. She thought about the word family and what it means when you take it apart. Not the legal definition, not the biological one, not the one Harmon Fitch would recognize from the outside. The actual thing, the living substance of it, the daily accumulation of meals and arguments and small kindnesses and the larger ones that don't get talked about,
The way people grow around each other, the way trees grow around obstacles. Not always neatly, not without marking, but thoroughly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Gideon looked at her. "That night in the Grange Hall, when you came in." She turned to look at him. "Were you afraid?" He was quiet for a moment. "Of what?" "Of all of us. Of what you were offering, of whether you could do it." He looked at the mountains for a long time before he answered. "Yes," he said. "I was afraid I'd make it worse, that I'd be—" He stopped. "That I'd be one more thing that failed them. But you came in anyway." "I'd already stayed out of that hall for 2 hours," he said. "Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself I had enough to manage on my own." He paused. "Then I thought about what staying out of it would feel like in March, in May, when the snow was gone and I was up here alone with my full root cellar and my empty rooms. And it seemed like a worse kind of afraid," he said. "So I came in." She looked at him. There it was. The thing under the offer. The thing she'd asked about in the root cellar that first day and gotten the beginning of an answer to. The rest of it. A man who had been afraid of the wrong things for a long time and had finally, in a cold Grange Hall in January, gotten them in the right order. "I'm glad you came in," she said. He looked at her. In the dusk, his face was that familiar combination of readable and not. The patience and the weathering. The quietness that was never emptiness. "So am I," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his. Not dramatically. The way you reach for something that has been near you for long enough that the reaching is just the natural extension of noticing it's there. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that while the light left the peaks and the stars came out one at a time, and the creek ran its constant sound below them. This was not a perfect thing. She knew that with the clarity of a woman who had survived enough to stop expecting perfection. There were things still unresolved. The grief that would keep its shape for years. The children's adjustments that weren't finished. The hard work of another winter already on the horizon. The 1,000 small abrasions of 8 people in close quarters, and the specific complicated territory of 2 adults finding each other in the wreckage of other lives. None of that was done. None of it would be neat. But there was something here that she could name now, without flinching. Something that had been built from the only materials available. Necessity and stubbornness, and the decision, made over and over in small ways and a few large ones, to stay. To keep choosing the harder thing because the harder thing was the right one. That was what she'd wanted to protect in the Grange Hall in January. Not just the physical fact of her children in the same place, the thread between them, the knowledge of each other, the thing that gets broken when families are separated and that sometimes, if you're not careful, doesn't grow back. She had protected it. Not alone. She hadn't done it alone, which was its own lesson, one she was still learning. You don't do the hardest things alone. You do them with whoever shows up and means it. Clara took her first real outdoor steps in the clearing on a Saturday in late August. She'd been walking inside for weeks, but outside was different. Uneven ground, the slight slope of the clearing, the unpredictability of surfaces that weren't plank floor. She stood at the edge of the porch steps and looked at the clearing with the focused expression she brought to physical challenges, and then she stepped off the bottom step and walked, with extreme seriousness and complete concentration, approximately 8 feet before sitting down hard in the grass. Everyone was there. All of them, which almost never happened by design. It just did. The way the family sometimes gathered without being assembled. Thomas, who was supposed to be in the woodshed. Martin, who had been on his way somewhere. Nora and Hannah and May clustered on the porch steps. Will standing near the woodpile with his mouth slightly open. Gideon, who'd been coming around the side of the cabin with a tool and had stopped. Clara looked at the grass she'd sat down in. Then she looked up at all of them looking at her. She put her hands in the grass and pushed herself back to standing, which took 3 attempts and a degree of determination that was entirely in character. And then she walked another 6 feet and sat down again. And this time she laughed, the full baby laugh, the one that doesn't hold anything back. At no one in particular, at all of them, at the grass and the mountain and the morning. Lydia did not cry. She had done her crying at other moments, for other reasons. But she felt something move through her that had no better word than yes. Yes to this. Yes to all of it. The difficulty and the cost and the accumulating ordinary days and this child in the grass on a mountain that was home. May said, "She walked," with the wonder of someone witnessing something they'd theoretically known was coming but hadn't quite believed in until now. "She did," Lydia said. Gideon crouched down and held out one finger toward Clara, the way he had with the snares and the tools and the plants and everything else he was patient about. Clara grabbed it and used it to pull herself upright, and then she took 2 more steps and grabbed the edge of his coat and stood there, looking up at him with the total confidence of someone who has decided this is a reliable surface. He looked down at her. Lydia watched him look at the baby, this child who had come up the mountain strapped to her brother's chest in the dark, who had been 10 months old in a crisis and was now something else entirely. A person with opinions and a laugh, and the particular confidence of a child who has never once doubted she was wanted. And she watched the thing in Gideon's face that he didn't say out loud, but that was there anyway. Thomas beside her said quietly, "He's good with her." "He is," Lydia said. "He's good with all of them." Thomas paused. "He's good with us." He said it like a conclusion he'd arrived at after careful consideration over a long time, which was probably exactly what it was. "Yes," she said, "he is." Will was already back to checking his trap line, because Will understood that the world kept operating on its own schedule regardless of what was happening in the clearing, which was perhaps the most useful lesson the mountain had taught any of them. Martin was asking Gideon something about the tool he'd been carrying. May and Hannah were arguing about whether Clara had walked farther this time than last time, using units of measurement they were inventing on the spot. Nora was listening to the argument and occasionally contributing a correction that neither of her sisters wanted. The mountain held all of this without comment, as it always did. It had no interest in their story. That was the thing about wilderness. It didn't care what you made of it, didn't reward you for surviving it, didn't recognize the distance you'd traveled to get to where you were standing. The peaks to the north were the same peaks they'd been in January, in the storm, in the long white silence of February. The creek was the same creek. The pines were the same pines. But the people standing in that clearing were not the same people who had ridden up a frozen trail in the dark in January with all their possessions on 2 horses, held together by a promise and very little else. What had happened here, in the cramped rooms and the cold mornings and the long trail and the fear and the work and the grief that didn't go away but learned to live alongside other things, was not a story about rescue. Lydia knew that now. Gideon had not rescued her. She had not rescued her children. They had done something harder and less romantic and more real than rescue. They had chosen each other, one ordinary day at a time, until the choosing became the shape of their lives. That was the only truth that mattered. Not that the hard thing had been survived. Survival was the floor, not the ceiling. But that in surviving it, they had built something. A table around which 8 people sat. Rooms where children learned to sleep without fear. A cleared slope where things grew. A porch where 2 people could sit in the dark and hold hands without needing to call it anything. The late August morning opened up around them, the light clean and the air sharp with the first promise of the coming season. And Clara stood in the grass and laughed at the mountain, and the mountain said nothing. And the family, this strange, accidental, hard-won, entirely real family, went about the business of their day.